Hi there. So this is Anna and Jonah Cummings, who've been fortunate enough to speak with Nina Walters, RN, BSN, in the local community health field. And she is here today to share her parent perspective of her son with Lyme disease.
Great. Thank you guys for having me. I just would like to give a little bit of a story about my experience as a parent and a nurse having my son have Lyme. So it was 2017 in the summer, and he, just to give you a tiny bit of history, he had just graduated from high school. He was like a top athlete runner, so he ran all the time at the different state parks locally. And I kind of always knew that ticks were a problem, obviously, but we hadn't experienced in our family closely. So I guess I just didn't worry about it. He came to me in July of that summer after he had graduated, and he's 18. He was in the shower and he noticed a tick on his rear end, and he tried to get it out himself because he's not going to tell his mother to come help him. So finally he broke down as he couldn't get it out, and he came and told me, and I said, Joe, I'm a nurse, I can handle this. So we got it out, but it was engorged, which means the tick is kind of swollen with blood, meaning it's also been there probably longer than he thought. It was in an area where he wasn't going to check normally. So I called the doctor. They gave him a one-time treatment of doxycycline, just a prophylactic dose, something they do across the board. I was a little nervous with it though, because I thought, it'd been in there a long time. I said, shouldn't we just treat him the whole time? He's like, no, I'll be fine. So he was fine. I mean, never really developed anything. About a month goes by. We're coming home from a family vacation, and he was just like, I don't feel so good. And nothing really, nobody had a cold in the family. He started to feel warm. And so I was like, yeah, you got a low grade temp. And so he went to bed. The next day, the temp was 102.5. Again, this is an active kid. He had no desire to get out of bed. I was like, Joe, you okay? I'm thinking maybe he's got the flu. I'm like, it's, July, beginning of August. I'm like, this is not a season where you'd even see weirder illnesses like this. So, but I gave him Motrin, the fever went down a little bit, but he just was a wreck. And the weirdest thing was he kept saying, like, my head is throbbing. The other thing was his elbows. He's like, I can't raise my arm. And I was like, oh, we'll see I'm a nurse, but like, it'll be fine. That's just body aches. You'll be fine. So I kind of blew it off that first day. I'm like, toughen up, kid, gave him Motrin around the clock. The next day, he literally couldn't get out of bed. And he was getting a little weepy. Like, I've never felt like this. The headache was pounding at this point. His temps progressively throughout the day were now at 104.5. The Motrin would take it down to like 102.5. But I still, as a nurse, was like, something's not right. And then just his inability to move. If he tried to sit up, he would lay back down. And I thought, of course, this must be meningitis, something else. So I said, Joe, I gave him a dose of Motrin. I said, let's get in the car. So we're going to go to the ER. We got to determine that this isn't something, meningitis is all I kept thinking. We got to the ER. Because he's under 21, they put you in the pediatric ER, even though he's this giant kid, and I'm not sure that was the best. That would be my one call, is I don't know if you can fight for that as a parent, but so they were very kind to us. They did blood cultures, thinking that maybe with the high fevers, he was septic for some odd reason, had gotten an infection. So they did blood cultures, they did blood work. I think they gave him a little fluids, but they were like, I think this has a virus. So we're just going to send you home. And I remember looking at Joe, and he was like, Mom, this isn't a virus. Like, this is nothing like I've ever had before. And I said, Joe, I know, but I don't know what it is. Of course I trusted them. So they sent us home. Well, that night, between that night and the next day, I've never seen my child sicker. 105 fevers, almost constantly. The Motrin would bring it down a little bit. His head was so bad. At one point he said, Mom, I think I'm going to die. And I was like, that's it. So I put him back in the car. We go back to the ER the next day. And again, this is not cheap to keep going to the ER. So I was a little bit annoyed. I was just annoyed, So I go in as an annoyed mom, like, fix my kid. There's something really wrong with him. And that whole day I had been on my phone all day. Like, what could these 4 symptoms line up to? Lyme was one of them, but there was a million others, So I kept, when I got there, I was like, I need you to test for this. I want a spinal tap. I want this. They didn't do anything. They said, oh, do you have any neck pain? He's like, no. They're like, you don't need a spinal tap. He was fully dressed in a hooded sweatshirt because he was freezing with this high fever. So they never took off his clothes. They never checked his body. They never did anything. And I was just ludicrous. So we got to 10 at night. The doctors come in and I said, listen, I really want him checked for Lyme. They started laughing at me, literally laughing. They said, ma'am, yours has a virus. Lots of kids get viruses.
Oh.
So of course I was like, of course I'm stirring as a mother. You know when your gut's telling you that something is not right. But they agreed. They said, fine, we'll do the Lyme test. They did the Lyme test. It comes back negative. Because if you know, the quick Lyme screen is going to screen for antibodies that he may or may not have at that point. So it's really not a good test or not a reliable test. And probably 75% of the time they're negative. So I'm sitting there and they said, we really have no reason to keep you. And I said, well, how about I speak to infectious disease? And they said, well, they won't until 7 a.m. and we have no reason to put you in a hospital bed. And I said, so you're going to send home this child who has 105 fever that you have done absolutely nothing to, and we just have to go home. So I was so scared to leave. I just was so scared to leave. So I called my friend who's a nurse, and I thought it was 10 at night, and I felt horrible to bother her, but I said, isn't your husband an infectious disease doctor? She's like, yes. So she woke him up, and she put him on the phone, and I said, I know it sounds totally crazy, but I'm in the ER, I've been here twice. He's got all these, I told the whole story about the tick in July, and he said, Nina, he has Lyme. And I said, well, I really feel like that is, but his test was negative. And he said, Nina, if I had $1 for every time the tests were negative for Lyme, I would be a millionaire. So I said, okay, what do I do? And he said, why won't they keep you? And I said, they say I have no reason to. So it was that back and forth. And he said, listen, call your primary right now, on call at night person. Tell them they need to see you first thing in the morning. If they don't, he said, I will personally keep you for Lyme. He said, I could bet my life on it. So I called my primary doctor. Thankfully, this was a new doctor, granted. So it was like a comedy of errors. Brand doctor, we hadn't even met him. Our old doctor had retired. So it was a brand new doctor. Thankfully, this man was from Saratoga. So he kind of knew, he's seen a lot of Lyme. I called him and I said, I got the night on call person. And I said, I really just feel like it's Lyme. I feel like it's something that we need to treat. And so he said, come in before office hours, like 7 in the morning, before anybody's here, to come in and let me see him. So we did go home, and I just literally laid next to Joe and kept him. We put cold cloths. We did whatever we could to keep the fever down and the headache down. 7 a.m., he looked 3 sheets to the wind, almost like death. We lifted him literally almost into the car, drove to the doctor's office. The doctor took one look at him and they said, how did they leave? How did they let you leave the ER? And I said, I do not know. And they said something was really wrong with him. So they took more blood cultures right there. And I said, listen, I've talked to my friend, and I told him the whole story. And I said, I really feel like it could be Lyme. He, not only does he has a landscaping business that he started himself, I said, he runs every single day through woods. And this kid lives in the woods. If you know my son, he's in the trees, he's in the woods. So he said, I believe you. And that was it was like I started bawling because he believed me. He goes, what's the harm? Let's try to treat him. You know what I mean? What would be the problem? If we treated him and it worked, fine. If he didn't, he's on an antibiotic. It's not the worst thing in the world. So I called my friend in infectious disease just to make sure we were doing the right thing. He said, yes. So we started doxycycline literally on the way home from the office. He took it in the car, and I'm on the phone with my friend. And he said, if it's Lyme, he said, it'll turn off like a faucet within a couple of hours of you taking the doxycycline. So I said, okay. So we took the thing, and I got home, I propped him up on the couch, and I'm, just letting him rest. He sat up about an hour later and was like, I can sit up. He called me from the other room. I can sit up. I was like, oh, okay. I'm thinking maybe I gave him Motrin. I'm trying to think if everything was, it's like, I can sit up. I said, okay, well, just rest. Second dose, 4 hours later, whatever it was, I think we were doing 3 doses that day. By the second dose, he stood up, walked out to the backyard. He goes, Mom, I feel amazing. I was like, what are you talking about? You were on death's door, not kidding, this morning. He feels amazing. So he went upstairs. He wanted to change his clothes. He'd been sweating and been in these clothes for 4 days. Goes upstairs, goes to the bathroom, screams as loud as he could, Mom, come here now. I thought, great, he collapsed. We got this all through. He comes up, and the largest bullseye I've ever seen in my life was on his rump, exactly where that tick was. We had not seen this. They had not checked his skin. And the doctor, then I called the infectious disease and I'm like sending him pictures. I said, is this it? And he said, that's it. And he said, probably it didn't appear until you took the doxycycline. It's what's called disseminated Lyme, which meaning you can have these appearances all over your body as the, the infection is killing itself off, that, is trying to kill the spirochetes. So I was just like floored. I mean, we were both like crying and hugging and I couldn't believe it. By the next day, I think he went for a run. It was so traumatic of a disease from so dramatic of a recovery that it was like, you got to be kidding me. So obviously it was bacterial. Now the interesting thing was when they did the blood cultures, they thought it was viral because his white count was very low. So in a bacterial infection like a sepsis, it's very, very high. So that's why they were like, it's just a virus, sweetie, go home. So my issue was when I looked it up later, in Lyme, you can actually have a low white count. So that was one thing. I mean, by the time I put all the pieces together, I was like, this is crazy. So he started and we put him on the longer, obviously, treatment, which is wise. I would never do a 1-day treatment again. I would do the full 21 days treatment at least, depending on your case. And then the problem was he went out west right after that, literally 2 weeks into the meds, he had to leave to go to work out in the state parks where he was going to volunteer with AmeriCorps for a year to live outside. So of course I'm a little concerned about that. So, from my perspective, now he doesn't see it and there's a whole lot more personal stuff that happened after that. But I know like in terms of depression and the things you deal with, it affecting his brain, I believe that's the cause of why we had a kind of a traumatic year with him that year. But, it's hard to prove that. So it's hard to, there's so much with maybe Lyme after the effects and chronic Lyme that I wish insurance companies and I wish doctors would recognize more. I've had friends diagnosed with MS who've lost their hair and taken meds and then they're 2 years later found out they had Lyme and now they're perfectly fine. So there's a lot of frustration, I think, out there. But for me as a mom, just going through that and you just fight, like you just have to fight and you have to ask questions. But I think if we live in an area where it's endemic, where Lyme disease is so endemic, we have to, as parents and caregivers, be prepared that that's the first thing we need to rule out, especially this time of year. I had a tick on me yesterday. I was cooking, crawled down my arm. I had just walked the dog. So I'm saying they're everywhere. They're everywhere. And if we are not aware of that, could be the first symptom. And if we treat it correctly and right away, these kids really will recover. But it's the weird cases or when it gets to the heart or the brain or, the muscle where we're not expecting it to be classic Lyme with the bullseye rash. That's when it's missed. That's when it can be even scarier and almost life-threatening in many cases, because this had become what they call like a Lyme meningitis. So anyway, that's my story. And thank you for listening and check for ticks and be safe outdoors.
Thank you for sharing.
Sure.